Welcome to another episode of the Christian Roads verse by verse commentary, and we continue now in the second chapter of the book of Galatians. Paul's letter, his personal letter to the Christians throughout the Galatian area. Okay, so we want to pick up in chapter 2 where we left off, which was somewhere around 5 or 6. And just as a recap, Paul has been recounting his some of his early history because he wanted to show the little contact he had with the other apostles and the Judean churches to counteract this accusation that he had learned his information from the apostles because he was not originally one of the 12. That he was perhaps a counterfeit apostle, wasn't really sent by Christ, the fact that he got his information from them, and again, all these things we talked about in the introduction. And so here's what Paul is doing. He's saying, I didn't spend much time with them. And he emphasized both at the beginning of this epistle and throughout chapter 1 and what we've been learning in chapter 2 that he's an apostle sent from Christ. He did not learn these things from men. Okay, so we're going to pick up now in chapter 2. He did talk about his interaction with Peter and James and those when he went to Jerusalem, which I believe corresponds to his visit along with Barnabas in chapter 11 of Acts chapter 11. Again, I just want to say it again. I do not believe this, what he's talking about in Galatians 2 is about Acts 15, the Jerusalem conference. I believe that this came before. We've discussed that quite a bit here so far in these episodes on Galatians. But, so this is before them. But he is citing in chapter 2 that, I did meet with the apostles, and they are wholeheartedly in agreement with what I preach and the fact that I'm out here talking to you guys. I'm not making this stuff up. I'm not just out here on my own as if Christ didn't really send me. But they agree with me. Because remember, the false gospel that the Galatians were being persuaded by is this false gospel of Judaism. That to be a Christian, you had to actually still come under the law of Moses. That salvation is still being a Jew. Following Christ, yes, but following Christ as a Jew. So you still had several of those in this early Christianity, which was at first a Jewish Christianity. Christianity in the very beginning was Jewish because it originates from there and spreads out. And so certainly there were, even though the apostles in Acts chapter 10 and the elders over there in Jerusalem understood the truth that Gentiles did not have to become Jews, but there were still many throughout Judean Christianity that still weren't quite on board with this. And I just want to say again, that the elders and the apostles and many of the Jewish Christians in the Palestinian regions probably weren't dealing with this controversy very often. They were learning about Jesus as their Messiah, how to please Him, how He fulfills Old Testament laws, but how the uncircumcised, unconverted Gentiles become followers of Christ was not something they're interacting with much. So we could still see how the apostles are still there, already agree with the truth that Paul preaches, but still there were a lot of Judean Christians still out and even close to them who weren't quite on board or weren't fully understanding this yet because it's just not something they're interacting with. But Paul, nevertheless, who's working with the Gentiles, is dealing with this every day because he's converting Gentiles with Jewish Christians there also, because there's Jews still there amongst the Gentiles in these churches as well. And you have Jewish Christians from Judea, from the Judean Christians, still coming to these Gentile churches, and this is part of the problem. You had Jewish Christians coming to Gentile Christianity, and all of this stuff in their minds had not been fully ironed out. What is my relationship to Gentile Christians? And we're going to see here in a second that you have Jews still coming from Judea who still feel superior to Gentiles, and there's even a segregation going on, which just infuriated Paul. Even that Barnabas himself gets caught up in the segregation. Because all these things were being ironed out here. Not that the truth was not made known. It was made known. But not everybody had fully understood it or grasped it or even accepted it. And here's the problem. But I do think it's important as we move along to keep in mind what the issue is, especially as he's writing to these Gentile churches. It is the fact that they were being persuaded to follow the law of Moses. Now, I want to emphasize this. In chapter 5, which I've said again, but just as a reminder, he says, "It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore stand firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. Behold, I, Paul, say to you that if you receive circumcision, that is, in order to become a Jew, Christ will be of no benefit to you." So this is what they were being convinced of. This is what they were being taught, and contrary to what Paul had taught them, that they were Christians as Gentiles, as long as they followed Christ, served him. But no, the Jewish Christians come along and say, oh yeah, you follow Christ, salvation is through Christ, but for a Jew. So you got to become a Jew. And this is righteousness. You got to be righteous through the law to be a follower of Christ. Because remember, the Judaizing teachers were not Jews that had not accepted Christ, telling Christians, no, you got to be a Jew, forget about Christ. No, they were Jewish Christians saying, yeah, you're a follower of Christ, but you still got to be a Jew. That is where righteousness comes. And Paul says in verse 3, "And I testify again to everyone who receives circumcision that he is under obligation to keep the whole law." And so remember what we're talking about. When Paul just cites circumcision, he doesn't just mean that one act, as if that's all that they were concerned about. That's a significant part of it. But when Paul talks about circumcision here, and the Judaizers, when they were compelling them to, quote-unquote, be circumcised, what this means is to become a Jew and observe the whole law. In fact, we know this is what it means. In Acts chapter 15, which was the same issue continuing on, it says, "Some men came down from Judea and began teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved." Well, circumcision according to the custom of Moses was much more specific than circumcision as it had been originally with Abraham. The circumcision with Moses, yes, it continued the circumcision aspect that had been bound on Abraham and his family and descendants by God, but the circumcision according to the custom of Moses was to be brought in under the whole Mosaic system, including all their laws, kosher laws and everything, and that's what the issue was about here in Paul's time. But in Galatians 5, again, it says, you are under obligation to keep the whole law. What Paul is saying is, now, keep in mind, if coming under the law of Moses as a Jew is how you intend now to be justified and righteous, because that's what the Jews thought, Paul's saying, let me remind you, though, if you really want to be righteous through the law, you have to keep all of it. Okay, you have to measure up to the entire thing. You can't break any of it. Righteousness through the law, as Paul teaches elsewhere, especially in Romans, comes through keeping it at all times. Anytime you break any of it, you are found a condemned sinner. And that's the problem with being justified through law, is that actually the law only ever condemns. It only ever condemns. It has a purpose, but it was never to make you righteous, because actually any law, God's law, only ever condemned, because if righteousness is through how you measure up to God's law, specifically here the Mosaic law, you actually are just going to be condemned, because nobody keeps it all perfectly. Everybody falls short. We've all sinned. But he's saying, well, the obligation is to keep all of it. You can't just pick and choose, and it's not just being circumcised, therefore you're justified. No, make sure you're abiding by all of it, and that's the problem. And so this is what the issue was. So in Galatians 2, picking up with him defending himself and showing that the apostles themselves agreed with what he had said. That's what he had been talking about, where we left off. he said, we went up there and we spoke to those who were of high reputation, that's the leaders and the apostles specifically, and not even Titus, in verse 3, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. In other words, as evidence that they agreed with Paul and had no different mentality than Paul did, Paul's saying, listen, if what I'm saying is at odds with what apostles in Judea say, then why didn't they force him to be circumcised? They didn't have a problem with him being uncircumcised as a Gentile. He wasn't keeping the law of Moses. That's his point. Verse 4, but this was because of the false brothers secretly brought in, who have sneaked in to spy out our freedom, which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to enslave us. What the effects of what they were doing was bringing us back into bondage. Now, what is this bondage? Well, I had talked a little bit about it in our last session, and this is going to come up more and more, but let's continue on here. But we do not yield or to give in subjection to them, even for a moment. That's why Titus was not circumcised, so that the truth of the gospel would remain with you. In other words, we didn't even give in a little bit, not even a bit, because we're not going to give them any credence to what they're saying. Now, verse 6, but from those who were of high reputation, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Well, those who were of reputation contributed nothing to me. But on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised, for he who had worked in Peter unto his apostleship, to the circumcised worked in me also unto the Gentiles. And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I also was eager to do. Okay, so in verse 6, it says, but from those who were of high reputation. Now, who's he talking about? Most likely, with the flow of thought, he's still speaking of what he talked about earlier when he talked about speaking in private to those who were of reputation. In other words, those who carried major influence. This would be James, especially Peter, John. And we see that James himself seemed to carry a special amount of weight and influence. It seemed to be the case, especially when you read about Acts 15 and that Jerusalem council that comes a little bit later after this letter to the Galatians. It's James who kind of, when he gives his final thoughts on the matter, it kind of, I'm not going to say brings an end to it, because they're going to have their decision based upon what the truth is, not on what simply James says. But this seems to carry a lot of influence. And he says, here's what I think we should do. We should write a letter, and this is what they all do. And even here, Peter himself, as we're about to read a little bit later, when certain people came with the credibility of James behind them, even though they were saying things contrary to what James believed. But since they carried the credentials of James, so to speak, Peter himself kind of buckles under their influence. We're talking about the Lord's brother here. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. But he says, but from those who were of high reputation, strictly speaking, as it might say other places, seemed to be something. In other words, they were perceived to be something special. But most likely, he's still talking about the same people. What they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. And I believe he's saying, well, they carry a lot of influence, so much so that Judaizing teachers who were leading astray the Gentiles in Galatia say, hey, Peter and James and them, they're behind us. We come from them. Paul is out here doing his own thing. See, Peter and James and them carry a lot of influence, but Paul is saying, he goes on to say, well, those who were of reputation contributed nothing to me. In other words, listen, they didn't add nothing as far as what we're teaching. They didn't say, well, make sure they're circumcised. Well, make sure they at least keep the kosher dietary laws of the Mosaic system. Well, make sure they keep the feast days. In other words, they didn't add any Mosaic regulations. They didn't bring any additional things to me. In other words, saying they obviously agreed and didn't find anything different that you should believe than what I have taught you, because they didn't say, well, but you at least need to make sure they believe this. This is necessary. Now, in Acts chapter 15, James does say, and they do say, well, make sure they get special attention to avoid fornication, things offered to idols, avoiding those things strangled, and so on. I believe what is happening there is he's saying, but keep in mind that these are especially egregious things to the Jewish communities, which is a little bit of everywhere. And if there's going to be peace and harmony, they need to be especially mindful of these things. But it wasn't a matter of binding Mosaic ritualism and ceremonial things. That was the point there. But to stay with the text here, he's saying, they didn't tell me to tell you to be circumcised. They didn't tell me that you need to be Jews. So when he says, well, what they were makes no difference to me, I think he's saying, well, I recognize that these people carry a lot of credibility, highly influential. But he's saying, but ultimately, the influence and the weight and the reputation they have doesn't mean anything as far as what the truth is. God doesn't care about that. Even if they had added something to me, Paul is saying, it doesn't change the truth. And I wouldn't have gone along with it. But the fact that they didn't should lend credence to what I've been telling you as the truth, and should counteract what these Judaizing teachers have been telling you. So, yes, they are of reputation, and you should know that these people who are highly esteemed didn't give me any additional teachings to bind on you. Nevertheless, it's not as if I really care about their reputation in the first place. God doesn't care about their reputation. Now, they had, like Peter was an apostle, and that meant something to God because God had appointed him as an apostle. But Peter's personal reputation with everybody would not outweigh the truth. Peter worked for God. It wasn't the other way around. That's what he's saying. So he's saying, to sum it up, I'm telling you things because they carry a lot of reputation, and I'm trying to show you that there's no differences here, that they're on the same page as me. Not as though I, Paul, think that, well, I need to have them on the same page, or if they had said something different, I went along with it. No, because ultimately their reputation doesn't change the gospel. God doesn't show partiality, and neither do I. That's what he's saying there. Now, in verse 7, he says, but on the contrary, furthermore, not only were we on the same page, and they didn't add additional Mosaic instructions, he says, but on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. For he who worked in Peter unto his apostleship to the circumcised worked in me also unto the Gentiles. In other words, he's building something. Well, he's about to make a thought, but typical Paul, and this is typical Paul the apostle. First of all, you'll notice typical things about Paul. First of all, he has very long sentences. Well, he'll take a sentence and carry it on and on and on. The longest sentence, I believe, in the New Testament is found in Ephesians chapter 1. It's this really long sentence. But that's Paul. He kind of just goes on and on and on and on. And sometimes, this is also typical of Paul, it's not just sometimes, it's quite often, he's saying something and then he adds this parenthetical thought. Kind of, he's saying one thing, and then he says, and just kind of adds to it this whole thought. And then he finds himself having to go back, once he's done with his kind of a side point, he has to go back and start the sentence over. That's that way in Romans chapter 5. Romans chapter 5, in verse 12, when it says, for through one man sin entered the world, and death by sin, so much of the rest of that chapter, which is a very difficult passage, is just Paul saying one thing. He interrupts himself with a additional but kind of important point, but then he kind of has to go back and restate his point. I mean, this is Paul. This is the way his mind worked. This is Paul. is used by the Holy Spirit to write these scriptures, but the Holy Spirit uses Paul's mind to do it, and this is kind of what he does. So he begins to say this sentence. If you can see it on the screen, for those of you watching, it's the statement, "But on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised," and then he has this parenthetical statement to kind of clarify it, "For he who worked in Peter unto his apostleship to the circumcised worked in me also unto the Gentiles." He then has to start over. "And recognizing the grace had been given to me," is kind of what he had been saying, "James and Cephas and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship." Ultimately, what he's saying is, these people that are considered pillars, and they were to much of an extent of their influence as apostles and elders. He does reference other people, but it's primarily these who were apostles, and James himself, the Lord's brother. James, the Lord's brother, carried a lot of influence. He wasn't one of the 12 apostles. He was an apostle in a sense. Paul calls him that in chapter 1, but not as the ministry of the 12. But Paul's point is, they gave the right hand of fellowship to me and Barnabas. In other words, they were in a wholehearted agreement with our ministry and what we do. There is no difference here, as the Judaizing teachers might try to tell you. But they recognized that just as Peter was very effective in his ministry towards Israel, Jewish Christians, and working with Jewish unbelievers, that is, Jewish people that had not yet converted to Christ, this was his main field of ministry where he could really come in. Peter was very effective in getting Jews to come to Christ and relating to them. And they recognized that, and as a parallel, it seemed to them that God had carried this much influence through Paul with the Gentile community. And recognizing that, they were wholehearted, saying, "Go at it. We're right there with you. Get out there in the Gentile communities and societies where you really do a great job, more than Peter might do, or us, because the 12 apostles were primarily working in Israel. But get out there because you are really good at it. God is really doing something with the Gentiles through you. Get out there, you and Barnabas, and go at it. And you have our stamp of approval 100%. That's what Paul is saying they were doing. And he's saying this is evidence to them that he was not at odds with the Judean leadership. Now, I want to say this. In verse 7, it mentions that I have been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. The Greek literally says that Paul is entrusted with the gospel of the uncircumcised. And uncircumcised, of course, is just meant to be spoken for the whole of Jewish ethnicity. In other words, the gospel of Jewish Christianity. In other words, the Jewish ethnicities. Taking, of course, uncircumcised here actually is reference to Gentiles, those who are ethnically and socially not Jews. It's not just circumcision, it's the whole of their community. So when he talks about the circumcised, he doesn't just mean the physical feature of not being circumcised or being circumcised in this case here. This is a reference to the whole ethnicity and tradition and custom of being a Jew and observing all these traditions and cultures or a part of their culture. And uncircumcised, he doesn't mean just the physical feature of not being circumcised. But in those days, unlike maybe here in America, if you weren't a Jew, you likely were not circumcised. And so you can kind of refer to non-Jews and a non-Jewish society and culture as being uncircumcised. It probably couldn't do that in America. It is my understanding that most people, men, are circumcised. At least that's my understanding. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's the way I've understood it for a long time. But not for religious reasons, obviously. But in those days, you could refer to non-Jewish culture and society as the uncircumcised. And so, that's what he means. So, but he says the gospel of the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been of the circumcised. And the King James there in that second statement would say that Peter with the gospel of the circumcised. So a lot of people would criticize the translation I'm using, for example, because it changes it to the circumcised and to the uncircumcised rather than saying of the uncircumcised. And the reason they criticize it is because, and these are primarily dispensationalists. Dispensationalists say there are two different kinds of gospels. There's a lot of people out there that would say this kind of thing. They'll say that Paul preached a unique message with a unique content to Gentile people that was not the same, that was distinct from the gospel preached by the Jewish apostles. I always say that. Paul was Jewish, so I probably should stop making that distinction. To the 12 apostles that we know of, that they preached to Israel, and it would have been a different gospel with different content, not contradictory to Paul's gospel. You could not mix the two gospels. And they'll say, and that's why they would not like this translation, because they think it's changing it to make it sound like one gospel. Well, I don't have a problem with this. I think that is what Paul means. When he says the gospel of the uncircumcision, I think he means to the uncircumcision. I think that's clear from the context. Because when he begins to restate his sentence, listen to the way he says it. And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James, Cephas, and John gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship so that we might go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised. And I believe that's the whole point. I do not believe at all, and I've given you my reasons even in these episodes, that there is a different gospel. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it now. I believe there is one gospel, and I believe this is the idea. Now, if there is a difference meant in verse 7, as I have explained, the difference is in the implications the gospel has. You see, there is one gospel content. The truth for the Jews is the same truth for the Gentiles as far as who Jesus is, how a person is saved, what God expects of you, promises that are made to you, the hope that you have, all that is exactly the same. Contrary to what dispensationalists may say. But nevertheless, the content still has implications for Gentiles that it doesn't for Jews. So, for example, the Gentiles the truth and the gospel would be good news because they could be saved from paganism. It would be good news to a Gentile that even though they once were not a people, remember the Bible says that kind of thing. Paul teaches that in Romans chapter 9. Even though they once weren't the people of God, but now God is including them, and that they are acceptable as much as any Jew would be if they follow Christ. That's good news that for a Gentile that wouldn't be quite as perceived as the Jew, even though the Jew is still a person of God who follows Christ for the same reasons. But the idea that, you once were not a people, but now you are, and that, now you could be saved. Well, the Jews always understood a relationship with God by following God, and so it isn't exactly the good news. Paul talks about in Galatians that they were saved from serving blind idols. He talks about that in other letters too. Not so much for the Jew. He was saved. The good news to a Jew is that his promised Messiah has come. He can now be in the kingdom that was once promised by the Old Testament prophets. But you see, the truth content is always the same, but it's good news for a different reason to the Jews in many ways that it wasn't to the Gentiles. But I do know that the content is the same. Even in chapter 1, at the end of it, Paul says, in referencing to what the Judean Christians had been hearing about him after his conversion, that in verse 23, he, that is Paul, who once persecuted us Jewish Christians, is now proclaiming the good news of the faith which he once tried to destroy, and they glorified God because of me. In other words, they had heard that what Paul is now doing is preaching the gospel and the faith that he once persecuted. Well, the faith and the gospel that he once persecuted is the one of the 12 apostles, which according to the dispensationalists preach a different gospel than what Paul did. Well, that's not the case. And by the way, just to remind you of what I've already said, the Greek does literally say the gospel of the faith. You won't see that in every translation because they're not always sure how to bring that on into English. But that is what it says. It's both the gospel and it's the gospel of the faith. But I want to digress from that point and move on because we've talked about it. But it is one gospel. But then he says, but the whole point here in what Paul is saying is we're in harmony. We're in fellowship. We're just working, me and Barnabas are working out among the Gentiles in a way that Peter and them are better at with Israel and bringing them to Christ. The right hand of fellowship, that's what that means. And when it says they were reputed to be pillars, they are highly influential and foundational in their roles and influence in the early church, especially among Israel. In verse 10, it says, only, here's one thing they did do. Now, he just said that they didn't add anything to me, or as it says here, they didn't contribute. What does it say here? You said that earlier. Contributed nothing to me. We just read it, and my eyes are not falling on it. Right here in verse 6. But now what he's saying, but here's one thing they did do, only in verse 10, only they had asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was also eager to do. One thing they did want us to do is remember poor saints in Jerusalem. That's what they wanted. Gentiles, because they were so numerous throughout the regions, but then you had the Jewish Christians who were having a hard time because of famine and other reasons. And what the one thing the apostles there in Judea did want Paul and Barnabas to do as far as with the Gentile Christians is to tell them, be mindful of your Jewish brethren who are having a hard time. And that's what he means. To remember the poor means give aid if you can. And that's what Paul did throughout the Gentile churches. Now, we did find this. Now, I believe that his visit with the apostles there in Jerusalem, I've told you this, occurs in Acts 9. Acts 11. At the end of the chapter. And it says, they talked about a famine that was going to happen. And in verse 29, it said, and as any of the disciples had means, this is back in the Antioch area, each of them determined to send a contribution for the service of the brothers living in Judea, remembering the poor, saints. And this they did, sending it in charge of Barnabas and Saul to the elders. They had already come there primarily, or initially, to bring aid and help from the Gentile churches to there. And I suppose in all these conversations, James and all of them said, well, I hope you continue to do this. Continue to tell them to remember the poor saints because we struggle up here. I've told you before, but let's run the reference again. In 1 Corinthians 16, it says, this is Paul doing this with the Corinthians. In chapter 16, verse 1, he says, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so do you also. This is what you need to do. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to set something aside, saving whatever he has prospered, that no collections be made when I come. And when I arrive, whomever you may approve, I will send them with letters to carry your gracious gift to Jerusalem. And if it is fitting for me to go also, they will go with me. In other words, he's saying, hey, Corinthians, I've given this order to other churches, and I'm giving it to you. Lay by every week so we can send help to the Jewish Christians. That's just what this is about. And so this is actually Paul we see fulfilling this very thing which he was already doing, as he talks about in Galatians 2. And so basically he said they didn't add anything to my teaching that the Gentiles need to do except for continue to remember the poor saints. But we were already doing this. That's basically what he's saying. Okay, now verse 11, it says, but when Cephas, that's Peter, he has several names. Peter has many names. Peter, Simon, Cephas, Simeon, he's also called. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. Now, Paul's about to talk about this confrontation he had with Peter. The point of it, I believe, is according to the flow of thought, either to show and to make sure it's known that even though Peter had done some things contrary to what Paul was saying, it was inconsistent with Peter, and Peter actually got rebuked. Now, perhaps the Jewish or the Judaizing teachers had brought up Peter, saying, hey, he separated himself. He didn't mingle with the Gentiles. I'll remind you of some, perhaps that was some of the case, or maybe if the chronology doesn't fit, Paul just simply wanted to show that he wasn't a man pleaser, and he wasn't seeking to please men. And when he wasn't in harmony with Peter and the pillars, quote unquote, as he called them, which they in many ways were, and when there was inconsistency between them, they were in error. And Paul wants to cite this example, not to knock Peter down, but to show that when they did differ from him, he did not go along. Because he just got done saying, listen, they are in harmony with me, or we are in harmony together. Peter and them do not have a different message. They do not oppose what I preach and to whom I preach it to, and they gave us the right hand of fellowship. He just got done saying they did not add anything to me except that we should continue to help Jewish saints. And this is a fitting example saying, and when they do become inconsistent, when they do differ from this message, I do not go along, and I make sure to call them out on it. And this is why this comes up with Peter. Let me read through it a little bit here, and then I'll go back and comment on it. It says, but when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For prior to the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, the men from James, he began to shrink back and separate himself, fearing the party of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, before everyone, if you, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is it that you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? Okay, let's get a few things kind of set here in our minds and then explain what is happening here. This confrontation that Paul has with Peter has been misconstrued by several. Some people have said that, even Peter and Paul disagreed on some theological points. Just kind of like people say about Paul and James chapter 2, and they'll say, James and Paul, they didn't always agree, but they still got along. Well, it may be true that Christians don't always agree, but these apostles and these men like this, they knew the truth. We may not always grasp the truth as we should be, and maybe we disagree about some things. You can be a Christian and disagree on things, certain things, not everything. But that's not really what is happening with either James and Paul or Peter and Paul. There is no indication, quite the opposite, that Peter believed certain things differently than Paul. It's just the opposite. Paul had just got done talking about how Peter and them, Paul and Barnabas, were on the same page as far as what the truth is and what Paul and Barnabas were teaching. He just got done explaining that there was no difference in what they believed. There was a fellowship among them, and that the Jewish leaders here did not add anything. That's what contributed means. So there was no difference. Peter knew the truth. In fact, you can go to Acts chapter 11, which is in the ballpark same era as Paul and them coming up, but that appears later in the chapter. But Peter knew the truth that Gentiles didn't have to be Jews. He learned that in Acts chapter 10. He tells that to the Jewish elders and the apostles in chapter 11, and they agree. So they already knew the truth. So this confrontation between Peter and Paul is not a difference in belief. Some people see this like Paul and Peter just simply didn't get along. No, there's no indication that they didn't get along. In fact, it indicates that Paul had understood Peter was being inconsistent and rebuked him publicly when he came and when they interacted. And there's no indication that they didn't get along after this. There's no indication of some prolonged grudges by no means. Peter knew the truth, and from every indication would have accepted the rebuke. And when we see Peter, of course, decades later, writing 1 Peter and 2 Peter, in which he specifically mentions our beloved brother Paul, there's no, likely, very plausibly anyway, 1 and 2 Peter were written when Paul had already died in the mid to late 60s. And has very kind words for Paul and echoes many sentiments of Paul in those letters. In fact, as the scholars recognize, I think accurately so, Peter is echoing Paul in many ways in his letters in 1 and 2 Peter. So, no, there's no indication that they didn't get along. This is the issue here is not that Peter believed something different than what Paul had already said he believed. This is an indication of Peter becoming intimidated by those who did believe something different, or at least acted differently, and he, inconsistent with his own belief, began to mimic them, being intimidated. So he was being inconsistent with what he believed. It's not what he taught. Although, yes, it is true that by his actions, anytime you act in a certain way, you are teaching something by your actions. But when I say he didn't teach something different, that means he didn't teach as doctrine, or he didn't say, hey, here's something different. So he's simply being inconsistent with what had already been established. And this was causing other people to give in to this false gospel of treating the Gentiles as something different because they weren't Jews. That's what is going on here. Now, it talks about him fearing the party of the circumcision. In other words, there is a group within the early Christianity, and they were wrong. There was not a good group. But we see early factions forming. This is the tendency of people. But we see this group that was influential in this idea of keeping a distinction between Jewish Christians and Gentiles. At the least, keeping the distinction when the Gentiles did not become Jews. And if they wouldn't become Jews, you kind of treated them as second-class citizens. And they kept themselves isolated. This is almost like the 60s and earlier decades when whites, in many respects, and many in our society, would keep themselves segregated from the black community. So this is happening within Christianity. It's not strictly speaking a racial thing, because it was more of a ethnic, religious distinction. Because you could be a different race, but still convert to Judaism. It's not strictly speaking a racial issue because of that. But it was a religio-ethnic distinction, if you know what I'm saying. Yes, become a Jew in practice, observing their traditions, being circumcised, integrating into their culture, regardless of your race. But if you didn't, they would see you as second-class citizens and keep themselves segregated. And the only reason you would do that is if you didn't see the other people on the same grounds as yourself. It was you looked at yourself as superior. We are Jewish Christians, after all, they would tell themselves. Not, they're Christians, yes, but they're not Jewish Christians. And that is what is happening. And it says, okay, so when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. As we see, this was causing other Christians, even Barnabas, to go along with this divisive, very divisive mentality. and because it had become such a public thing, and because Peter was publicly so influential, it was absolutely necessary in Paul's mind that he rebuke him publicly. Not every rebuke is appropriate for public rebuke. But Peter, who's because of his public reputation, could carry such a disastrous influence, and was, in fact, publicly, it was necessary to call him out publicly. That's what he did. That's what he did. For prior, and so Paul is here explaining what Peter's problem was. It wasn't believing something different. It wasn't disagreeing. He says, for prior or before the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. Okay, so stop there. So there was a time when, appropriately so, Peter does know what the truth is. I mean, it's not his belief that is wrong, because right here we see that he eats with the Gentiles. Now, Jews didn't normally do that. But since chapter 10 of Acts, since that age or since that time, Peter knew the Jewish distinctions did not matter, and the Gentile Christians were acceptable to God and just as good as they were. So here he is eating with the Gentiles. So this is where Peter is doing good. Here's a Jew who did what Jews used to absolutely refrain from doing, and that is eating with Gentiles. Because you know why? Because Gentiles eat things that Jews don't eat, like pork and other things. But here's Peter eating with them because he realizes those distinctions are not important. So there Peter's doing good. So before the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but when they came, he began to shrink back and separate himself, fearing the party of the circumcision. He became intimidated by their influence, what they would think of him, what they would say about him, that they might turn on him. And he began to segregate himself. So at one point, Peter is eating with the Gentiles consistently, so being consistent, realizing that Christianity unifies them all, and so he ate and was one with the other Gentile Christians. But when the Jewish Christians from James came, who were of this Judaizing mindset that they shouldn't have been, they would kind of eat by themselves and wouldn't mingle. And so Peter became a little bit intimidated, and so when they came around, he segregated himself and didn't go over with the Gentile Christians. And this was bad, because that action says something opposite what Peter was doing and what Peter believed. So when Peter was eating with the Gentiles, it showed the truth of the gospel, that they were all one and the same in Christ. But when he began to separate himself, he's now saying something different by his actions than what he believed, which is, no, actually there is a difference, and we Jews are a little better than you guys, and we need to keep ourselves different and separate and eat by ourselves and observe our Jewish distinctions because you don't. And thus he was counteracting his own beliefs and creating a distinction that Paul labored so hard to break those distinctions down and to teach the Gentiles that they were just as good and just as accepted to the Gentile or to Christ as the Jewish Christians. Okay, now when it says, when certain men came from James, we know that James himself, the brother of the Lord, agreed with Paul. He just talked about that. Paul just talked about that a little bit earlier. We can go, and in our last episode, we already went to Acts chapter 21. It shows where James understood the truth. He wasn't opposed to Paul. And we see in Acts chapter 15, which does happen later in time than this epistle, we see James is the one who says, he writes a letter with the rest of the apostles and elders in Judean churches. He writes a letter to the Gentile Christians and says, do not think that these people that say that you should be circumcised, they don't represent us. So go back to Acts 15. We've already talked about it, but go back and read what that letter says, where James explicitly says, we did not command these people to tell you to become Jews. So it's not as if James himself is sending these men to do this. They don't represent James well. Of course, the question has to be asked, how could it be if they're coming from... They are obviously Jewish Christians that were associated with James, probably in some of his work, how he ministered, helping him and, laboring with him as, like Paul had Barnabas working with him and certain people like Timothy and Titus that helped in his ministry, and so that they might go in his stead, so to speak. But if they were coming and segregating themselves and had this false mentality of a distinction between Jewish Christian and Gentile Christian, but James didn't, how could that happen without conflict with James? Well, I believe ultimately it would have, especially in the time of Acts 15. I think Peter, when James says, we did not tell them this, and they're all talking about this, I think it would have become clear, we do not represent this belief. But how could it have been happening here at times before? Well, as I have said, keep in mind that in Jewish society, and Jewish Christians and the Judean churches would not have been interacting with this issue that much. It just wasn't coming up. They probably weren't interacting with a lot of unconverted Gentile Christians. I'm not saying it didn't happen at all. It did happen in Acts 10. But primarily Jewish Christians would have been Jewish converts, even if they had previously been Gentiles. They would have been already observing Jewish customs and traditions. And it was about getting these Jewish people on how to live for Jesus, how to serve him, and how to convert other Jews. This was their life. And we see James in Acts chapter 21 when Paul comes up there. I'm not going to get into it again because we talked about it last time. But what Paul tells, or what James tells Paul is, we see that in Acts 21, he agrees with Paul in what Paul teaches. But what James does see the need for is that when Paul's around Jewish culture, like when he's in Jerusalem, he needs to be careful with the Jewish traditions. Because it would be hard to work around Jewish people that you're trying to convert to Christ if you're out there saying you don't have to keep the law anymore. You don't need to do any of these things. Because it didn't really matter if Jewish people still observed circumcision and the holy days and observed the dietary laws if they came to Christ. Those things weren't the primary concern of Christ, whether they observed a day or not. And so James's attitude was, let's be respectful of these beliefs amongst Jewish people. So that's why it probably made it easy for these people, these Jewish men of this mentality, to continue to hold to this extreme view, to keep them like, you do have to be a Jew. Because when they're with James and all these in Jewish society, they're keeping the law. They're observing these holy days and probably these dietary laws, and James shows himself very respectful of these things. So it's easy for these men to come to Gentile areas and to say, well, this is what we do, you need to become Jews. But it wasn't really James' mentality. This is probably how this happens. I do hear a certain dispensational give James a bad name. They even call him the James Gang. And they present him in this light of James as this, he just doesn't get it, and he's hindering Paul's gospel, and he's a Judaizing teacher too. No, it's not the case at all. But, okay, so this is the problem. This is what Peter does. And it says, and so keep in mind, I even think that there's some people listening now in the side chat that have had this view that, well, the problem here is that Peter was teaching things that he shouldn't teach. Even like some people will say and have said they're like water baptism. No, that has nothing to do with it. It's not about what Peter taught. It's about his conduct was inconsistent. That's it. That's the only thing in the text that is rebuked by by Paul. Not, well, you teach them to observe these customs. No, because you segregate yourself when the Jews come around, you are compelling Gentiles that, well, they need to be Jews. So that's the point, and we continue on to show that. So, let me read it again. For prior to the coming of certain from James, Peter used to eat with the Gentiles, but when they came, he began to shrink back and separate himself, no longer eating with them. That's what it means, no longer eating with them. He didn't mingle with them anymore because they were uncircumcised Gentiles, fearing the party of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews joined him in this hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before everyone, if you, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles. Okay, let's stop there. What does he mean? When he says, if you live like the Gentiles, how did Peter live like the Gentiles? Well, he just explained it. He used to eat with the Gentiles. When you eat with the Gentiles, it is a Jew living like a Gentile, observing their foods. You see, Jew and Jewish culture, according to the law of Moses, did not eat pork and other forbidden meats. And you had other things that you did. You did not mingle with the uncircumcised. But that's not what Peter was doing. He knew the truth. He was eating with the Gentiles. He did not live as if these distinctions mattered. So Paul says, if you, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles, in other words, if this is your typical conduct before, you are a Jew, nevertheless you live like a Gentile, you eat with the Gentiles, this is the consistent behavior of Peter. And not like the Jews. In other words, when you're with the Gentiles, you don't try to act like a Jew. That's the consistent part of Peter. How is it? Now here comes the rebuke, the inconsistent part of Peter. How is it that you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? In other words, when you segregate yourself, as you have been doing now, when the men from James come around, when you segregate yourself, you are, by doing that, compelling the Gentile Christians that they need to be Jews because you're separating yourself. And that, by its very nature, compels them, well, you're not as good as us. You need to be like one of us. If you want to come over here now, you need to be a Jew. So that's what Peter was doing. You, being a Jew, previously lived like the Gentiles and not like the Jews before the Jewish Christians came around from James. But when they come, then you segregate yourself. Now you're compelling the Gentiles to live like Jews. You're doing the opposite of what you were doing. So you were laying aside your Jewishness to live like the Gentiles, but then what you do by your action, you actually tell the Gentiles by your behavior that they need to lay aside their Gentileness and live like Jews. You're living in contradiction here. That's what Paul is telling Peter. But that's it. That's the only rebuke. There is no rebuke for specific teachings that Peter was doing. Well, he taught the Gentiles to be baptized. He taught them to do this. No, it's you segregated yourself. That's what he did. Now, he goes on in verse 15, we who are Jews by nature are not sinners from among the Gentiles. Nevertheless, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ, even we have believed in Christ Jesus so that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law, since by the works of the law no flesh shall be justified. Well, verse 15 is a continuation of what he's telling to Peter, because he says, we are Jews by nature and not sinners from among the Gentiles. In other words, this is the typical Jewish mentality, that what distinguishes you is you are a Jew by ethnicity, and you have the law of Moses. This was always the Jewish mentality. The Jewish pride was that they were ethnically Jewish, descendants of Abraham, and they had the law of Moses, and that made them righteous. And they always looked down upon Gentile society and outside of Christianity. I mean, this was always the case with all of them. Well, generally speaking, nonetheless. Is that the Jews had this national pride of we have the law and we are Jews by nature, not like the Gentile heathens out there. And so their confidence in their righteousness was in those things. And Paul's point here is, it's to make a contrast. What he's telling Peter is, now listen, you know that even though we're Jews by nature, not sinners from among the Gentiles, as is typically understood among Jews, that the Gentiles, because they're not Jews, are sinners, but we are, so we're Jews by nature. But he's saying to Peter, but nevertheless, you know that true justification and righteousness is not through having the law of Moses or being a Jew by nature, which is what all this means. He's basically saying, when you segregate yourself, Peter, by your actions, you're trying to compel the Gentiles that justification and righteousness actually is through the law and being a Jew by nature. And it does, in fact, degrade the essential truth of the gospel, which is that justification, acceptance to God, is through faith and not through Jewishness. It is not being Jewish by nature and you're a sinner because you're a Gentile. It is through faith. That's what he's telling Peter. Now, we're going to pick up, again, we're going to bring it to a close in this episode because there's a lot in these last few statements that we could really get into. Now, so keep in mind all these things. We're going to talk about justification, what it means to be through faith, and the contrast. We could spend a lot of time on this. Now, I realize so far we're kind of moving slowly, and there's a certain benefit to kind of moving quickly, verse by verse. If you're one of these guys that likes to pick up a commentary, just has a few notes on each verse, and you kind of want to move, this is probably not your cup of tea, you know what I'm saying? This is kind of in-depth study, because I really want you to be able to grasp these things as we move through the verses. What is being said? So you just have to bear with us as we kind of move through slow. We're still in chapter 2. But that's just the way it is, okay? So I hope that you've been benefiting from what we have done. We will pick up next time in Galatians chapter 2. We've kind of ended in chapter 2, verse 15 and 16. To be picked up again. Hope you'll study ahead. Be ready for the next session. Probably our next show on Thursday. Next Thursday will probably not be verse by verse, but Bible Reasoning, which is a live interactive show, of course. The last, if I remember correctly, the last verse by verse we did was on a Saturday, so it may pop up some other time. So just look for it. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you click the notification and the bell and all that, so that if I do a verse by verse or any other program on some other day besides Thursday, that you'll be notified. Sometimes you may not get a big notification. I think the last time I did a verse by verse, it may have been 2 weeks ago. I can't quite remember. It was on a Saturday, and you didn't have much heads up. But, subscribe, click the notification. That way you will have a heads up. So more than likely, next Thursday, Lord willing, we'll be doing Bible Reasoning. It's a live call-in show. So anyway, thanks, everybody. God bless.